Okay. Hello. Hi, everybody. And welcome to Go to 10. And for tonight's event, all very welcome here. And for those who have not been to Go to 10 before, welcome here. And if you have any questions about it, or if you want to become a member, please talk to me and I can help you with that. You can be a member here. This is a co-working space, an event space. And it's a free space as well, so if you want to come here to work or to meet people and or arrange your own events, that's great. And yeah, and it's run by this crowd here, Internet Stiftelsen, Internet Foundation of Sweden, and Go to 10 is part of their program to promote digitalization here in Sweden and support people and startups and. Yeah, all very welcome, and I'm just going to pass you over now, and start the event. Thank you.
Thank you. So, hello and welcome everyone to the first event with East Sweden Tech Women and is this on? Is it on? Yeah. With East Sweden Tech Women together with AI Sweden and Linköping University. My name is Julia Bergman and I work as Communications Officer at Linköping Science Park, where East Sweden Tech Women is one of many projects and initiatives that I work with. So before we start, I just want to show you the agenda of what we're going to do today. And I hope everyone has found something to eat. So now we're going to start with presentations and then we're going to wrap up with an Q&A. And afterwards, we're going to grab some more fika. And the number you got when you came here is going to be where you're going to sit later, because we're going to have group discussions and get to know each other a bit better. But first, what's East Sweden Tech Women? East Sweden Tech Women, we are a relaunch of the previous, or what you say, East Sweden Tech Girl community that maybe some of you have heard of before. And we are a network that for women and non-binary individuals in the tech industry. And we want to arrange events that can be both inspirational or also more with the focus on technology, maybe like a hackathon or something like that. And based on the needs and the wishes of the network, we are open to arrange events or collaborate with different companies and organizations. So please don't hesitate to contact us if you have any suggestions for topics or anything you would like to see that we could arrange. It could be someone you want to maybe see on stage, or maybe you want to show something, maybe have a workshop, maybe go to a fair in another country. I don't know. It could be anything. Nothing is too small or too big. And I also want to highlight some of the upcoming events. The first one is next week, where we have a breakfast meeting together with Ebbe Park, focusing on diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And we also have on June 8th, Rebecca Karlsson, who will talk about, how do you say, exponential climate solutions and sustainability. So you could sign up for that on our Linköping Science Park's website. And last but not least, I highly recommend you to join our East Sweden Tech Women LinkedIn group, so you won't miss anything. So now I want to hand over to Annette Bystedt, who is Node Manager of AI Sweden, and we'll talk a bit more about just that.
Thank you, Julia. This is a co-event with AI Sweden, and I work as a Node Manager in AI Sweden, and I will tell you a bit about, just briefly, what AI Sweden is and what our mission is and what we do. Okay, so AI Sweden is an organization that is funded by Vinnova, which is the innovation agency in Sweden. And the mission is to accelerate the use of AI in Sweden. We do not primarily work with research. but rather work with applied AI and getting companies, organizations to get started on their AI transformation journey. And why Vinnova funds this is because they see that it's very important for Sweden to become or to stay competitive and to actually tackle the challenges that we see in the future, both within public service but also within companies, to actually utilize the new technologies and the what it can gain, but in a safe and sustainable way, because it's very easy to go wrong with AI as well. As I said, it's Vinnova funded in the base, but it is a national center, so we do not only operate here in Östergötland. We have offices all around Sweden, and our partners that we work with come from all over Sweden. We also work actually with international relations. We have an office in Canada, in Mila, a center for AI there. And we work with other centers, AI centers that are similar to our organizations around the world. We are neutral, non-profit, and broadly funded, and we target everybody. So the public sector, the private sector, small companies, to global tech companies, and also academia, to work across sector and to promote collaboration around AI issues. And what do? We do a number of things. These are just 4 main groups of things that we do. The basic part is collaboration. So partner networks and to share knowledge is one of the foundations of the organization. So, and we work both sector-wise, but also within, across different sectors in topics that concern AI. So it could be legal questions, it could be technology-based questions, focus groups, and things like that. Talent. One of the major issues for companies to accelerate is that they can't find talent. We do not have enough talent in Sweden, so we have to work both with academia to how to train more talent, but also get international talent to find Sweden and to come to Sweden and work here. We also work with shareable knowledge and resources. This is actually the largest. It doesn't show here, but in this graphics. But here we have resources both in form of capacity, a data factory where we get hardware and capacity to work, but also best practices. We have collaborations around how to do an assessment of how AI mature is your organization. How do you take the next step in your transformation? And we always try to do things that can be shared with many. So we do not work one-to-one with one company, but we work with several companies and then share the knowledge so that the next company that comes in or next organization, they can take and start from a new starting point. And then leadership. One of the biggest things in Sweden, in general terms, is that we have tackled AI and handled AI questions as a R&D question, but we see that AI transformation and AI to adopt AI needs to come also from a leadership, and it's a big investment for organizations to actually do the transformation. So we need to work with public affairs and how to get investments on a larger scale in Sweden to go into AI. And we use Nils van der Poel. He is a gold medalist in skating from the Olympics, and this is a quote from him. He wrote a manual on how to become the world's best skater when he retired, and this is so telling of what we want to do within AI Sweden as well. if everybody starts from baseline and starts to learn and do internal work on AI, it will take a long time. But if we collaborate, everybody can start from a new starting point, and we can gain insights as a collective, and we will accelerate faster. I'll just show you this, because this is actually a research or an investigation done by a German organization and similar to AI Sweden. But it's proven to be true for Sweden as well, that we have 75% of our organizations, not only private companies, have not even understood that they need to look into AI or do not know what AI is. Cross-sector, not only tech sector. We have 10 to 20% that have they've seen that they need to investigate. They've done something, a prototype. But we only have a few percent that's taken AI and incorporated it at a larger scale in their organization. We do not need to take all of the organizations up to being shapers. This is where we see Amazon, Tesla. But we want to push some of these 95% that we see here up to at least becoming practitioners. That's AI Sweden's goal. Okay, with that was just a very brief insight into what AI Sweden is and what we do. I'll hand over to Julia again. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Annette. And just to wrap this introduction up, East Sweden Tech Women want to be a part of closing the gender gap in East Sweden and be a natural place for women and non-binary individuals to connect and meet with each other. And equality isn't something we can take for granted. It's something we need to care for. And with that in mind, I will hand over to Professor Ericka Johnson, who will talk about how we can use AI to improve equality in our organizations.
Okay, now you can hear me. Maybe a bit too loud. Thank you. Right, this one I think. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Great. Okay, my name is Ericka Johnson, and I'm a professor of gender and society over at TEMA, which is the social sciences interdisciplinary department at Linköping University. I work in gender studies. I do a lot of teaching also at the technical faculty on new courses that are just starting up these last couple of years that are becoming some of them mandatory, some of them electives for technical students on how to think about gender and diversity in their future engineering careers. Some of those insights and conversations that I have in those classes are going to appear here, but I also am running a couple of research projects at TEMA which are social sciencey. So they're not techie, but they're looking at things like the integration of social robots in elder care and in healthcare. And also the use of synthetic data, but the way that synthetic data, when produced through machine learning practices, tends to overemphasize majority classes, protected classes, and underemphasize minority classes, and what that does for our understandings of data and the use of it in terms of, in opposed to raw data. So those are some of the research areas I'm working on. I have a PhD in a field that's called Science and Technology Studies, STS. And one of, I wanted to mention, so I have this arbetsskada. I'm like terribly, I'm a professor. So at the end of this presentation are going to be 2 whole slides of links and references that you can either photograph or maybe they can be shared through this anyways, because I'm going to be referencing a lot of other people's work here. And some of it you might find really interesting to go forward with. So that will be coming at the end. Right. So science and technology studies is a field that's about 40, 50 years old now, has looked at the way that science and technology and society interact and intersect and how these nodes interplay with each other. What impacts society has on technology, what impacts technology has on society. And of course, that becomes a very complex and integrated entanglement. One of our urban legends that we talk about in every introduction to STS class is usually contains a story about Robert Moses, who was an urban planner in New York City for decades, where it started in the 20s, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and he was tasked with making sure that New York City would be a very livable place. At the time, in the 30s, especially in the 30s and somewhat into the 40s, there was a large fear in America that urban areas were becoming dark and cavernous places full of crime and mental ill health is what they were concerned about. There was, at the same time, an idea that if you could just get people into nature, they would, of course, be feeling better. We hear that also in Swedish society, that, you know, nature is good for us and for our mental health. So one of Robert Moses' plan was to, increase the size of Central Park, which he did significantly, to the, not so much the benefit of the poorer people who lived around it, who he displaced, but, you know, we don't talk about that so much, but they made this huge giant park that expanded. And then also try to create ways for people who lived in Manhattan to take on the weekends and get out to the lovely park spaces, nature reserves that were also being built and developed at the same time, primarily in Long Island, although there were some other ones around the city too. Long Island was, at the time, a long island. Here's a picture of it. Manhattan is here. Here's Long Island, and here's the Atlantic Ocean. All along this coast, they developed a whole bunch of nature reserves from areas that had at one time been farming communities, and they were really, really well developed. Curated, articulated as parks, and then they decided to also build a parkway, several parkways out from the city, so basically freeways where you could drive on the weekends to go out and let your health feel good from the nature. Here's a picture of one of these parkways. Now, of course, they had been rural areas, so there were, of course, old wood gravel roads, some of them paved all around there. And if you're going to build a parkway, a freeway, you can't have it just cross over these roads and create an intersection where there will be lots of car accidents. So instead, they built overpasses along these to facilitate the existing pathways that were there, the small roads. But if you'll notice from that picture, or if you notice from this picture, each of these little pink squares is a place now where the New York City Department of Transportation has a warning sign because there's a very low overpass. Of course, this is a very low overpass. And what happened was that this parkway was built. It allowed and facilitated all of the people in New York City to come out and enjoy the nature out in the nature reserves in Long Island, as long as they had a car that fit under the overpass. But 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, this project was several decades long. Still, today even, but especially then, there were only certain classes of people who had access to private cars. Other people chose public transport. These overpasses at the time were too low for the buses. Now, there is a lot of debate. Did Robert Moses do this on purpose? Or was this just like an oversight from him? Because of course he had a car. So his friends had cars. They just needed to get the cars on the road. Or was it, as some of his more recent biographers would attest, a conscientious decision on his part to limit the skin color of the people coming out to these nature reserves? Or the class, but in America, of course, that overlaps very clearly. What happened was that these areas became areas that were accessible to people of a certain class and often of a certain race. Now, I'm going to show a modern picture. This is from a fairly problematic website called bestneighborhood.org, where you can go out and check and see the income of the neighborhood that you're trying to buy a house in. But if you notice here, green is the really wealthy neighborhoods. Reds and pinks and yellows and oranges, those are the more poor neighborhoods. And there's a really distinct correlation between where the overpasses blocked out the people who didn't have high incomes and where, after decades of continuous repeating who has access to, whose bodies are placed in these spots, we have an income distribution that looks like this. I'm not going to stand here and say that Robert Moses's overpasses were the reason for income inequality in America or its geographical positioning, but it also helped. And again, it's entangled. All of these things become really untangled. But what we end up doing when we think about or don't think about the norms that we're building into our technologies is that we build technologies that reproduce the existing values that are in them. And Robert Moses Bridges is one case of that. Now, this is where usually when I'm lecturing my engineers, who are second-year engineers, they get all upset and they're like, but not our responsibility. Okay, fine. But then I'd like ask them some of these questions. We want our city planners to think about the obduracy, the stubbornness, the long-lastingness of their infrastructures, because we expect democratically built cities that will share our values. We expect our educators to teach in an inclusive way, because we expect fair schools. We expect our medical doctors to vow to do no harm and also to treat all patients, because we expect to have unbiased doctors. New pharmaceuticals, as they're developed, have to go through incredible testing and have to be tested on a wide variety of potential patients, because we expect safe medicines. Why on earth would we have an exception for tech workers? Should we not also be expecting the same type of thoughtful working practices from the developers of what are going to become our long-lasting tech infrastructures? Because as we go forward and develop tech, we are actually developing the infrastructures that we have in our society around us, and those will stick with us for quite a while. I'm not going to go through all of these examples of where that has not happened, because I'm sure you're already well aware of them. The ideas about facial recognition, which faces are recognized, Bulawami's work on that. Policing algorithms in the US, we've all read about those stories about how we're predicting what kind of crimes will happen from which bodies in unfair ways. These are stories that talk about misrecognition, but also talk about recognition in ways that we don't want to be recognized. They are narratives that talk about allocation harms. Which resources in society are we going to distribute through our machine learning algorithms, for example? And we are finding that many of these occur because of both explicit bias, but also because of implicit bias. There's been some really recent interesting stuff on these large language models and the way that even when we clean the data, the language models for example, gendered terms like man, woman, aunt, uncle, even nurse, doctor, if we wanted to go that far, we will still end up, when we run the algorithms on them, finding that there are clumps of categories underneath that become gendered in and of themselves. Because guess what? We live in worlds that are categorized for us, and gender is one of those ways that we categorize our world. So regardless of how explicitly we try to clean the data, the implicit understandings that exist in our world are still going to be there and are going to change the way that the machine will understand what's happening in, for example, a large language model. Another problem, of course, which I'm sure you're all aware of, is legacy data. Sometimes I want to call this old fart data. It's just data that's existed for, decades and has been produced in different contexts by different people who maybe saw the world in different ways than what we want to see it today, who had categorizing practices and categories in their heads, which already were creating a way of seeing the world that's going to produce a bias for those of us who are not in the normative structures of that. Dangers of this type of practice of using somebody else's glasses to see the world, somebody else's who's maybe, was active 30 years ago with some of this legacy data that we're using, is that we really clearly see how labeling becomes an act of power. When we start to label categories of people, even with a categorization that is in some cases so obvious from 20 years ago that we would have man and woman, we now maybe are going to be applying that data to a collective that doesn't have just two genders or is divided up into different non-binary ways of thinking about bodies. We also see that by creating this type of algorithms using categorizations, we may be producing visibility. And even when we intentionally try to create visibility for groups that are minoritized, that creation of visibility is also producing a risk, because we don't know always where that data is going to end up or where the analysis of it is going to end up. And it may end up in the hands of structures, state or otherwise, that are, for one reason or another, interested in prosecuting or persecuting those types of minoritized groups. So the process of labeling is really powerful. Trying to label widely and inclusively is also really, really good, we would think automatically. But on the other hand, as we do that, we make visible categories of people and collectives that maybe don't necessarily want to always be visible. So it's a really double-edged sword with visibility and visibility and the use and then the misuse of data. Those are some of the dangers. Of course, there are ways to complement them, but they're not necessarily easy. So I've got in the end here a bunch of references to papers that talk about it. Some of the things that you can pull out from those conversations are ideas that we need to complement the data, potentially even through qualitative methods. So thinking about data as something that is not just data points, but is data points about contexts and trying to see the context and do research on that. How do you do that? Often through interdisciplinary teams. How do you do that if you're an engineer who's just been assigned data from a domain expert and it's the domain expert's data that you're working with, not yours? That's also really problematic. What does this type of division of labor between the engineers who work with the data and the domain experts who come to it do for the types of work that we think that we can legitimately do on the data? One thing to do is continuously be asking ourselves, why are particular categories framed or relevant in that data? I would guess that in some of our working practices, it's not really appreciated if we come back to the domain experts and ask them why their categories are the way they are. But I also think it's a really important question. And the more people that can ask that question, the better. And then one other thing that I think we really need to continuously do is think about the temporal aspects of data. Temporality being, okay, I have this legacy data that is 30 years old. How has an understanding of the world that was prevalent there and then changed now? Or also, now I'm creating this data like it is now. Is this really going to be legitimate in the product that I'm producing or the type of algorithm I'm working with in 5 years or 10 years? How can I imagine something else? That's not an easy ask. This is usually where my undergraduate engineering students start to glaze over and like, oh, it's not my problem. I don't know, maybe not their problem in our classroom right there, but again, back to that one slide about what we ask of our doctors and our teachers and our city planners, I think we have to start asking things of our engineers as well. Okay, but still, our world is biased, but maybe AI can help. That was the title of this project, right? Maybe it can. So I'm thinking one of the big commonly understood myths, not myths, narratives about unequal data comes from healthcare and comes from heart care or cardiac care. It must have been already 40 years ago. It became very apparent, first in the US and then looking internationally, that many more women died of heart attacks than men. So given the equal number of people coming into a hospital, which of course it wasn't actually equal, people who had a heart attack were more likely to survive if they happened to be a man. Why was that? Well, turns out, one, people had different access to care. So fewer women, this was in the 1980s and 90s, so it's very binary. Fewer women were actually coming to the hospital. When they did come to the hospital, they came to the hospital later. And part of that was because they themselves didn't recognize their symptoms of a heart attack. It didn't necessarily start with pain extending through the arm. Could sometimes be pain in the jaw. That wasn't one of the standard definitions or symptoms of a heart attack. And then their doctors didn't recognize their case or symptoms as a heart attack either once they came into the hospital. So we have an entire diagnosis system for heart attacks based on the normal body, which is the male body, which is actually not the majority body, but which is the normal body. So here's a big question about what our data is like showing anyway. And that shows the symptoms that are male, and it presents them as the norm, and the bodies that don't have those symptoms are the minority in this categorization process, and they're invisible in the data. We have tried, not me, people have tried to address this discrepancy in heart care for decades. It is still not really working. We still have more women dying of heart attacks than men in the West and the North, but it's getting better. Part of it is because it's really hard to change understandings of what a disease is. So if you still ask people, well, what's the first symptom of a heart attack? They're probably going to say, oh, pain in the chest that extends out through the arm. And that is the case for some bodies, but not for all bodies, not even for all bodies that identify as male. But what could we do about this? Well, we're trying to create more data to present the female heart attack as part of the norm and put that in the data. There are studies collecting that real raw data out in the world and trying to show how it changes. But we still have this legacy data. When we go back to cardiology healthcare, we're still dealing with data from 30 years ago. What could we do about that? maybe AI could help us. And here I'm bringing up an example from a company over in California who's gone in specifically looking at cardiology data, healthcare data, and tried to create a synthetic version of it by messing around with the weights and the algorithms and the original raw data to like oversample and produce what then will become a synthetic database that does represent both bodies equally. I think there's a lot of things to unpack in that. But I think there's also a lot of hope to see in that maybe there is something that we could do with, among other things, synthetic data and the way that we then use machine learning practices to try to identify a heart attack as we develop more and more AI-assisted technologies to engage with patients that would possibly try to go in the right direction there. However, I also want to show with that slide and bring in the idea that AI is not going to do it alone. When you first produce machine-learned synthetic data on the databases that exist, you are going to be reproducing the original data with all its biases. We actually have to think conscientiously and consciously and quite politically to think and decide what types of data that we want to be producing and reproducing, and try to actively, and here I say actively with the direct tonal reference to activism, try to change what we're doing with the data and become activists for the data that we use. It's us. It has to be us who try to figure out how to use the AI in the right way, because the AI is not going to do it itself. We need to do it for it. We need to work together with it. And that kind of change takes effort. So here's my big tema gender thing. Guess what? We have to go out there and be activists and change it and do it. And change is hard, and it's actually quite often confronted with resistance, because what we're suggesting in, for example, the previous slide is that you go in and mess with the raw data, that your synthetic data doesn't represent the raw data. And to do that, you have to actually be able to convince the people that the raw data is not what you want in the first place. Not an easy sell. Let me tell you, I try all the time. But the raw data is not what we want, because the raw data gives us the world that we have right now. And the raw data is produced from the world with the power structures in it that we have right now. And that's not what I want, anyway. I'm going to guess not what you want either. So step one, how do you do this, especially if you're an engineer? I would say, first of all, you have to really know your data and think about your data. And that includes having a whole toolbox of terms that you can bring with you into conversations about that data. And here's a place where you're going to find some of those tools. This is a book that came out a couple years ago. It's open access. You don't have to have a university account to get to it. It's amazing. It's beautiful. And it talks about how data is actually really not serving us right, and how we can change it. And they have principles of things like examining the power, challenging the power of the data, elevating emotions, elevating embodiment, trying to resist the idea that data is somehow disembodied, is objective, thinking about pluralism actively, thinking about what kinds of categories you're using when you think about pluralism, thinking about context. This is kind of our big shtick over from the social sciences, and making the labor of doing that data work very visible. If you take one thing home from this talk, take this book home with you. Go out and Google it. It's great. But once you have the data and know the data, that's really not enough. You have to be able to do some good stuff with it. And here I just want to slow its slog, or make a case for the idea of thinking through different ways of thinking about design, even in engineering practices, even when you're really just sitting there with the algorithms. Think through about your design practices and your working types of practices. There are all sorts of tools out there for that. One of the more recent ones that came out here is Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Embodied AI from a group of researchers at Utrecht University. It's also available online. There's a link at the end. It has both theoretical conversations about how to design for AI in a good and equitable way, but also some really hands-on concrete tools to get your teams involved in doing that. How can you get the people you work with to be thinking through these questions with their data as well? Data for data sheets. Data sheets for data sheets is data sheets for data sets is an article that I'm guessing half of you have probably read anyway, because it was making a big wave. It was a big wave in my bubble anyways, like a year and a half ago. My bubble's kind of weird, I get it. But data sheets for data sets. Really great article about thinking about how we can actually be conscientious of the data sets that we're using and what we can do about it to make it more visible for ourselves and others. Norm critical design and innovation. There's some great tools coming out of Sweden. Here's a set that was developed by Vinnova, by a Vinnova Satsning project that gives a whole deck of cards in your hands, physical material objects that you can use in your design team conversations, in your planning team conversations, to actually get everyone on board about thinking about what the object of the project is in a really norm-critical way. The design justice principles are great. I don't know if you guys have been out to the designjustice.org website, but here's a book also working with it. It's listed in the back. Really, really exciting understandings about how we can include diversity in our teams and what it means to be including diversity, and then also critiquing that and asking how can we actually become more diverse rather than just including things as objects with us. Also, there's like the fact groups, other groups online. There's conferences about this. There are lots and lots of resources out there. So it's really a matter of picking up the flame and going out there and using those resources. And then the one thing I actually want to point out too is that it's great if we do all of that, but maybe there's an unnatural distinction between our imaginaries of what we do in our work and the teams that we work within. And maybe we should also spend some time to think about how the teams we work in can themselves become more diverse and can themselves become more inclusive or promote belonging, depending on which type of language you want to work with and what kind of language takes your conversation further in the sectors or collectives you're working with. But I think there are some really key areas that research has shown do help us to produce more diverse teams to work with together. And that is recruitment. I'm sure many of you who work in tech probably are really highly sought after because you're women, and women in tech are sought after by some teams, and that's great. If you're looking for women in tech, I tend to get this conversation from different collectives that have a hard time finding women in tech, and I tell them to just look forward. And here, organizations like this can be really helpful. Professional organizations for women is a good place to start. Advertise widely. Think about how you're advertising so that you're not turning people off by your images or text in the advertisements. And then when you're selecting candidates, think very carefully about what criteria you're actually using to select them. I have the picture of the orchestra up here just to illustrate implicit bias. Orchestras are traditionally one of these areas, workplaces that are predominantly male. People have wondered why for a long time. There were some psychologists and work organization practice sociologists who did a study looking at recruitment, and they decided to do a blind recruitment with an orchestra, and they had all the people, because when you get recruited to an orchestra, it's through an audition, you play. So it should be based on how well you play. But they were still primarily male. So they did this blind audition where everybody played one-on-one behind a curtain, and the judges in the audience couldn't see who it was. And at the end of that audition session, it turned out they had primarily selected the male candidates. So the question was, is it just so that the men actually play better than the women? But then they did one more round of auditions, and they forced everybody to walk on stage in their socks and walk off stage in their socks. So you couldn't hear the dunk, dunk, dunk or click, click, click as it came in. Turned out 50-50. So there was an implicit bias, but it was really hard to see. And it's really hard sometimes to see our implicit biases, even when we're talking about CVs that we're evaluating. A lot of the funding bodies, for example, in Sweden have started going in with observers in the discussions so that people are there trying to point out when implicit bias is occurring, when we're talking about candidates differently. That's one way to do it. Being aware of it is another first step. It's very hard. It's very hard. I think the research on the large language models shows how hard it is, actually. And some days I just want to pull the covers up over my head in the morning and be like, this is not going to work anyway. But I think we have to also try. So implicit bias when you're selecting. And then maybe also equally important, think about and be able to articulate what type of work cultures we are working in. Do we have a collective in our workplace that allows people to be who they are? Do we have seminars or work meetings that allow everybody's voices to be heard relatively equally or not? And how can we, as managers, which some of us are and others of us will be soon, how can we try to create workplaces that are really inclusive for lots of different people? So I guess that's my main point, is that to try to avert low overpasses or try to even take them down, we have to work both with the technology, but we also have to work with the rest of our life around the technology as well. So there are lots of tools here that I think a person could go to for design tools and readings about them. The politics of data here. Stand out of the way in case you want a picture. I do expect you to all go home and read them the rest of the week, just so you know. I'll send a report later. Here are some podcasts and online resources that might be useful, and just some other great stuff to read, which basically talks about AI a lot. But a little bit, this Winter 1980, it's the Bridges one. And it's an interesting read. It's also available online for free. But it talks about the way our built environments really do have an impact for many, many years to come, and they're full of values. And that's something we navigate every day, but we don't have to build more environments that are having values we don't like. So I guess that's all for me. I can take some questions, but thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. I was wondering, because we talk now, or you talk a lot about averting and design for, but we do have a lot of solutions out there already. Have you seen any examples of how we can use AI, or how AI has been used to identify hidden or unidentified? Because sometimes you're so biased yourself that you actually can't see. It's easy when it's male or female, but sometimes it's more hidden than that, and it's more complex. It's have you seen any how AI can be used in that sense to identify when it's already been built in?
I'm trying really hard to pull something up here. And no, it's a very good question. I wish I could come with a whole list of things immediately. I'm sure there are some. And I'm sure that some of the resources here can be places where we can find them. So for example, the designjustice.org and ruhabenjamin.com. She's an author who's looked a lot about race and technology, race and computer technology. She has a whole resource page where many of the places in both of these two websites are referring to primarily activist types of collectives. So activists who are using AI and other types of, mostly AI actually, technologies to really try to identify and change. And so I would start there. I think it's pretty easy to see the places where it goes wrong. It's not always as easy to see where it actually does something good. So go out there and check. But it's also quite inspiring to see how identifying the wrongs can be a way of destroying the house with the master's tools, as some of our feminist foremothers have talked about, and showing how we can actually build something better.
Yeah, anyone else? I have a question, and that's, what do you think organizations like eSweden Tech Women can do to help this process alone?
I think a lot. I think actually just events like this are good because we're raising the conversation and starting to have it. I think that's super important. Also, again, for recruitment or other types of support structures when you're in the workplace, having a collective of people that you can find some sort of outside of your professional immediate sphere camaraderie with is extremely important. That we see over and over again in all sorts of workplaces. If you can have a place where you can come back and relax and not be the minority, the representative of an entire class, the only woman in the room, but come back into a room where you have other people in there, becomes a really important space for those people. But also serving as a communication channel for people who, for example, are looking for women in tech for a recruitment, and being able to go out and stretch your hand out and say, look, we can help you access women who are in tech, who maybe are looking for a new job or a shift. Becoming a networking node like that's really important. Yeah.
Thank you. I think it was a very interesting presentation. I'm definitely going to take a look at the links and the books.
Thanks.
And my question is, you mentioned in your presentation that sometimes when you bring up these topics with your students that probably are engineers, they are not really keen to look into these topics. And I wonder, how can we increase the interest of engineers that are not students but are currently employees of many of the companies that we work today, and they don't really want to talk about this, but somehow we need to make them understand that the products and services that they create, and also like the recruitment process, can really help out to society overall, like how to bring up that conversation.
Yeah, this is tricky. It's a really good question. It's very tricky. The reason I've been teaching this one class, it's been 3 years now that we've been teaching it, it was because one of the engineering programs over at the university decided to redo their curriculum, and as a process of that, they sat down and talked to the education board for that education. And the board had people from industry on it, and people from industry said, we need to think about these things. So I think there is, at some level, people who are interested in doing that even out in industry. But one of the things I think they also saw was that the education period is a time where you have students who are forced to take a class. And these kids are forced to take the class. Like literally the first day they come into it and they didn't realize they signed up for that when they signed up for engineering. And they sit like this and they're very unhappy. And it takes an entire term of working with them to get them on board. But one thing we do is we work a lot with these design tools that I showed earlier, these like hands-on physical design tools with them as they, in a parallel course, are designing an app. So they're programming an app, which is like the real stuff they do, but they have to do it in parallel with our course where we talk about intersectionality, we talk about power dynamics, we talk about designing to see a wider user out, you know, and we force them with these design tools to do that. It's an easy kill because they're forced to come into the classroom. Like I just require mandatory attendance, otherwise they won't pass, and they have to pass. So this is easier for me than it will be for you out in the workplace. But I do an awful lot of exercises with them that are physical, that embody them. We do privilege walks. We have them map their privilege. We do intersectionality wheels. Then we do the design cards. We just do everything physical with them outside of their computer. So they're not in their computer and they're embodied. And suddenly they realize that they actually are embodied themselves, which I think is one of the things that if you're the norm, you can go through life without realizing, because you just slide on through the world, built and otherwise, without realizing you're an embodied member of it. There's no catching on it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So just out of curiosity, what programs are you teaching this class to?
So this is the obligatory course is for the IT-ingenjörer, and there's only 30 of them a year, so I get like 30 to 35 of them. It's a second year course, 1 term, and that's the obligatory one. And it's gone down pretty well. It's actually gone down really well, surprisingly well. I thought for sure they were giving me this job because I have tenure and they can't fire me, so it doesn't matter what the class reports will, or the course reviews will say. But it's actually become really successful. And so now the faculty has opened it up a parallel course for as an option, fristående kurs for technical students who want to take it. So people who want to can take one. And now this next fall, we're going to have a unit in the obligatory PhD course for all the tech PhD students, where they have to take a session on diversity and gender. So it's like the ball is rolling.
It would have been really, really useful for a lot of people back in the days, I would say.
I think so. I can, if it's, yeah. I was so happy to get the question 4 years ago. I mean, it's a scary course. I'm terrified teaching it every year because it is full of people like this. But we've been knocking on the doors of the tech fac for 20 years from Tema Gender, trying to say we could teach this class. And suddenly, 5 years ago, there was a shift. And we came in. And I'm so happy and grateful because I feel like we're doing a lot of good stuff. Yeah. Thanks.
Keep up good work.
Thank you. Thank you.
What do you think will happen in the future? Or what would the future look like?
Yeah, it depends on which day you find me on. I think there's a lot of work to do. I think we are building a lot of really low overpasses at the moment with the types of technologies that are coming out of the commercial and research bodies that are doing this work right now. I think we have a lot of work to do, all of us, to go out there and help and make it better. Both to tear down the existing ones that have already happened. I mean, I'm sure you guys have all read the reports about the large language models being biased, especially around gender, but in other ways too. I think there's a lot of tearing down to do, but I think we can build up better data as well, or better ways of using data and AI. The other thing I think we need to continuously remind ourselves is that these are overpasses, but there are workarounds. Those overpasses still exist on the Long Island freeways. It's still possible to get a truck out to the end of Long Island. You just have to know the route you need to take. It's a longer route. You have to exit off and go back on in places, but you can still do it. So the world is not only the world of the AI and tech. We can work around it too.
I think we had a question there.
Thanks. We've been focusing a lot of risk, but I also want to have your perspective on this with potential and innovation and our progress to be had from these ways of working. So could you say, if you think of us using these and potentially new and even more advanced versions of this, what do you imagine is the impact that could be had for the use of the AI technology in a better way?
Mm-hmm. I think that one thing we tend to focus on with AI is that it's producing knowledge, or it's like making knowledge available to everybody. And these are the same sort of things that I imagine in very different languages and words were said when we got the printing press ages ago. Like suddenly this knowledge is going to be accessible to everybody and useful, and we'll spread it all over the place. And that's to some extent true. It's great. We had great, the books did a lot for us. But I also think it becomes really clear when you look at the history of, if we even just take Europe, how those books spread particular knowledges and particular values and who had control of them. And again, I want to say that I think we can do great things with this, of course, but we have to continuously focus on which people, which actors are using it to which ends. It's not a matter of the AI being itself and distinct entity with agency, no matter what we hear from the media. It's a matter of that AI technology being used for particular purposes by particular people. And claiming that it isn't is a way of abdicating responsibility for that. So I think we have to continuously force people to claim responsibility for how they're using it, and force people to use transparency in where they're using it. And we have to do that ourselves. But we can use it ourselves if we learn the tools ourselves as well. Yeah, Tema Gender is full of activists. We have to go out there and do it, but we have to do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, me and my classmate, we thought maybe we took your course last year, the Norms Creative.
Yes, you were in the Norms Creative Design course. I
Yes,
thought I
yes.
recognized you. Yes, hi.
Yes.
Thank you.
So I'm thinking, because you said you arrange your students like design app
Yeah.
while taking the course. I'm wondering like what's your purpose for them to design an app? Because design an app is like quite common and like AI related. I'm wondering.
Totally agree. Because the course, so these are two different courses that I'm talking about. The one that you guys were in was the Norm Creative Design class, where we had lots of different norm and design conversations going on, which was really fun. And at the master's level, right? That's the master's level, yeah. So this is an undergraduate course, and it's for IT engineers. And the people who apply for that education, they just want to learn how, not all of them, but some of them just want to learn how to program because they think that's what they're going to do. So the courses are all designed around things that they think will be interesting and productive for them to engage with. So it's a parallel course that someone else is teaching, where they have over a whole term, learn how to program an app in a group. That's what I get to work with. So I work with that, and we design and think about the users for the apps and different ways of thinking about accessibility and usability for an app. Those are like really interesting questions, but also how, and here I feel like we never really get to the point, but how we could think around norm creative and norm critical design and really design the app to produce an understanding of the normative aspects of the world that make the user be forced to understand it. Like, for example, I think we talk about the gynecological chair and the urology chair in that lecture that I had for you guys. Yeah. So a material artifact, it could be an app that really forces you to be embodied in a position that produces norms for you. Yeah. We never really get there in the course, but I try every year.
Yeah, but I still have another question.
Okay, yeah.
So for AI producing something, how can you use this, or engaging students using like AI producing, let them understand the equality problem?
Yeah, how?
With like course assignments.
Yeah, with course assignments. Okay, I'm actually very, very willing to take suggestions from the audience on this one. But I think being able to do it, one thing I think we as social scientists who come into the field and start talking about it have a tendency to do is to think that it's just really easy. We'll just like change a few parameters on this programming and make it better. And of course it's not. It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of work, especially for courses. So trying to work in parallel with people who are doing that process or maybe those courses over a year's period of time, I think it takes a lot of time though. It takes time. And always going in there and thinking again. Some of these tools work for that though, especially the tools about users and the norms that are being built into the assumptions about the users. Yeah, thank you.
Do we have any last questions? Yep.
I think it's great that we have these courses for students, but I think it's even important to have it for the people already out there and working. Are there similar courses, for example, in uppdragsutbildning?
Not yet,
huh?
But maybe that's a place
we can
for me
arrange
to
one.
say. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that both the types of like engineering courses that I was talking about, but also these norm critical design courses that we talked about here, they have a lot of things that could be very useful for people who are already in the workplace. Yeah.
Mm.
Mm.
Do we have any questions from online? Then I think we could wrap this up, and thanks again, Ericka, for this presentation.
Thank you, all of you, for coming. Really, really fun to be able to talk about this with a whole room of people that are interested in it, instead of that are sitting like that.
Yeah. I think we should give her one last applause.
Thank you.
So now we are going. You can grab some more fika over there, and now you have your ticket or number. And Annette has. You could take the. What do you say? The paper and grab. You could grab a table and meet up with the other that has the same number as you. Oh.
Gather in the groups and then we'll see the
Yeah.
people